Ladies and gentlemen, you are watching The Political Vigilante. My name is Graham Elwood. We're joined by Danny Haiphong. I wanted to bring you back on the show because I want to say once a week, at least once a week, there's some sort of hysteria about China in the news. You're covering it way more than I am, which I love, and your knowledge on the subject and how much China is misrepresented. And the fact that you're immediately called like a China puppet, it's like, well, I got to have him on the show then. I mean, I'm good friends with Lee Camp. He's a Putin puppet. I just love you guys puppeting me around. I can't think for myself. So I love having puppets on the show. Just, and even time somebody accuses you of that, I'm always like, well, that's another reason why I know what he's doing is good work, because you're calling out the nonsense. And one of the things right before the show, I was just going to scroll through Yahoo's homepage just to see what is the most recent China's the Evil Empire story of the day. And from the weekend, I just heard about this. Some UFC fighter, had a Chinese flag wrapped around him, like every UFC fighter from any country in the world, like Max Holloway, who just recently fought, he's from Hawaii. He'll wear the Hawaiian flag because Hawaiians sort of identify with the Kingdom of Hawaii, which was illegally stolen by the United States in 1893. Anybody. Conor McGregor has the Irish flag, but a Chinese fighter wears the Chinese flag and it's ripped off his shoulders. So, tell us what the current state of affairs are. And just, we don't have to discuss too much the UFC thing. We can get into bigger issues, but that to me is just sort of endemic of this is what happens when you propagandize people and create this hysteria. We're seeing it, obviously. Last time we had you on the show was right around the time that Putin invaded Ukraine. And it's a very similar, China hasn't invaded anybody, but it's a very similar thing where if you point out America's involvement in Ukraine at all, you're just labeled, so you love Putin bombing the shit out of civilians. Like, no, I don't like that at all. So how do you, how are you seeing all this currently, and what have you been reporting on that maybe our viewers aren't aware of?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's a lot going on. Over the past few days, the United States, Joe Biden's administration just signed off on its fifth arms sale, or at least proposed arms sale agreement to Taiwan, which is yet another violation of the One China policy. If your viewers may remember that it wasn't not a month and a half ago that Joe Biden said that he was committed to militarily intervening in Taiwan should China, quote unquote, invade. And so in 1982, this was, I think, the third joint communique between China and the United States as they were normalizing relations and as they were talking about the Taiwan question, and as they were formulating this One China policy where, the United Nations 11 years ago had already stipulated that the People's Republic of China was the rightful China to sit at the United Nations as the national representative. In that joint communique in 1982, it says very specifically that the United States is going to wind down its arms sales to Taiwan, because it had been ever since 1940, ever since Taiwan became occupied by the former ruling party, the Nationalist Party in Taiwan, and then established the Republic of China there. The United States had been pumping arms there. The United States almost went to nuclear war with China over Taiwan. And we have Daniel Ellsberg to thank for violating the Espionage Act intentionally to break that news, to break that information in those documents that come from, I believe it was 1959. So in this 1982 joint communique, it says very specifically, the United States will not sell more arms to Taiwan in any consecutive year than it had in that year, and that eventually they would end. The United States has only increased these arms sales. There's a $14 billion backlog of arms sales, and this is since the end of the Trump administration. So now there's 5 more arms sales slated to Taiwan, from everything to naval logistics and all kinds of weaponry, a lot of it old weapons, but nonetheless, we see what's happening in Ukraine. Old weapons are used as well. So uh, that is one really hot flashpoint right now. And we have Mark Esper, the former Trump administration Secretary of Defense, who is still receiving pay compensation from Raytheon after leaving Raytheon as a high up in the weapons contractor right before he joined the Trump administration. But he's there right now, about to meet with Taiwan's Tsai Ing-wen, the so-called president of Taiwan. And this comes just days after the Biden administration approved this massive arms sale. So that's one thing that's happening. And then a really, I think, important non-story right now is that the United States is enforcing what's called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this is the most broad sanctions that the United States has leveled against China. It essentially is an industry-wide import ban from Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which has been infamously said to have quote unquote forced labor and genocide of China's Uyghur ethnic minority, all of which, of course, are based on straight myth making. But these sanctions are significant because a lot is made about how Russia's military operation in Ukraine has influenced the economic crisis, this inflation crisis that the world is in. But actually, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is very important. One, it carries half of all of China's freight activity to Europe. So that's where half of China's freight activity to Europe goes. It's a key cog. It's the largest producer in the world of polysilicon, which every solar panel and most renewable energy products require. And it also is a massive exporter of cotton. So basically, if you think of like all these big corporations from Nike to H&M to any of these huge corporations that sell clothing on this huge global market, they are being hit hard by these sanctions, and it is worsening the inflation crisis. So you have these two things happening, and you also, I think, have I think, the biggest story over the past month, which is the NATO summit and NATO's new strategic posture, which says that now China is a threat to NATO's security and that NATO is now going to place an emphasis and a focus onto China. And that's a big deal because
Jesus.
on the one hand, the NATO's existence is illegitimate, right? I mean, even if we just look at the last 3 decades, a lot has been made about how NATO's whole mission was to defend, quote unquote, Europe from the Soviet Union. To me, a questionable thing, really something based on the new Cold War. I mean, on the old Cold War. But once the Soviet Union fell, once it was no more, the idea of many, especially many people who stand on the side of any kind of peace, say, well, NATO's existence isn't really, it isn't really legitimate anymore. But yet it's expanded. It's expanded across Eastern Europe. It's admitted countries like Estonia and Latvia, which are on Russia's border, and now Sweden and Finland, which are incredible provocations. And of course, Ukraine is right at the center of NATO expansion and has been since 2008-9. It was basically made a de facto NATO state around that time. But now it's focusing on China, which China has nothing to do with the North Atlantic, right? China is all the way in the Pacific. But this just exposes how NATO is just a U.S. military alliance that cobbles up and gathers around its junior partners in Europe and then Turkey and a few others to wage war on the planet. Because we know that NATO, they had to put out a whole video on Twitter saying they're a defensive alliance. That Russia's making up all these lies. But we know NATO is instrumental in Afghanistan. We know NATO is instrumental in Iraq. We know NATO, before that, in 1999, bombed Yugoslavia, overthrew Libya in 2011, tried to do the same to Syria beginning in 2011. None of those wars were defensive. And now they're saying they need to pay more attention to China in an obvious ramp up of this new Cold War. So that's just a bit of the landscape of what's happening in terms of what the United States is doing and how it's maneuvering, right? Because there's so many maneuvers. Biden was just in the Middle East. He was talking to Israel and Saudi Arabia, and he couldn't stop talking about China and Russia. Everything was about how to keep Saudi Arabia from China and Russia, because Saudi Arabia has pretty good relations. Saudi Arabia is looking maybe to trade in the RMB, in the yuan, oil to China. And the United States is not happy about that. So the United States is doing everything it can to try to pull all of its so-called allies away from China. It's not really working. And so what we see is a lot of these desperate attempts to weaken China. A lot of it blows back onto the United States and onto Europe, like these sanctions. But the situation becomes more dangerous on the military front when we're talking about direct arms transfers to Taiwan. Biden directly 3 different times in just a year and a half saying that the United States is committed to a military intervention if China should invade. So there is a basis here to really worry and to hopefully mobilize against these really aggressive maneuvers, which I think need to be opposed just as much as NATO should be opposed in all of its dealings with Ukraine.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about this last time. I talk about this in my show all the time. I mean, we have basically surrounded China and Russia with American bases. So, and we're funneling, weaponry to Taiwan. And again, I say this to people like, yeah, but China's the big evil empire. Well, there's much to criticize the Chinese government on, but they haven't been bombing the Middle East for 20 years now, have they? Like, they didn't create 6 million foreclosures here. Our banks did, and the government and the two parties that are bought by them did. China didn't poison the water in Flint, Michigan. They haven't, the reason we have excessive gun deaths in this country, it's not Chinese soldiers running in and shooting up parades and schools. It's Americans doing that. And that's again fueled by the gun lobby. It's for-profit domestic terrorism. And, I like, we do all this big flexing in front of China. I mean, we do all of these military, these naval operations in the Sea of Japan. Just, can you imagine if China's Navy was operating in the Caribbean? Like, we would go absolutely bananas. We would go insane if they were doing that. And that's in essence what we do with Japan all the time. And not to mention all the weaponry you're talking about to Taiwan.